On a humid summer evening in 2003, Hannah, a college student, drove along a deserted stretch of rural Pennsylvania road. Usually serene, tonight, the air felt thick with unease as the twilight faded. Hannah had always been an adventurous soul, eager to embrace the unknown. But as her little blue Honda Civic meandered through dense forests and empty fields, an inexplicable unease crept into her thoughts. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As she rounded a bend, Hannah spotted a figure on the side of the road. A man stood there, his thumb extended in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with messy hair and a tired expression. Despite the gnawing apprehension in her gut, Hannah decided to pull over. "Need a ride?" she called out, trying to mask her nerves with a confident tone. The man nodded, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Thanks. I'm Mark. My car broke down a few miles back," he said, sliding into the passenger seat with a weary sigh. "I've been trying to get to the next town for hours." They chatted as Hannah drove, her initial wariness gradually easing. Mark seemed friendly enough, sharing stories of his travels and adventures, but something about his eyes unsettled her, a fleeting darkness that she couldn't quite place. After 20 minutes, the conversation faded, and Mark's demeanor shifted. He grew silent, his gaze fixed on the road with unsettling intensity. Hannah's unease returned, the knot in her stomach tightening. Shadows from the passing trees seemed to stretch and grasp at the car. Just as she was about to ask if everything was all right, Mark turned to her with a chilling, almost predatory smile. "Do you believe in fate, Hannah?" he asked, his voice low and unnerving. Her heart skipped a beat. "I suppose so," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Mark leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "I believe we were meant to meet tonight." This ride was no coincidence. Fear surged through Hannah's veins. She scanned the surroundings, desperately searching for any sign of civilization, but the road stretched endlessly into the darkness. Her mind raced, struggling to come up with a plan. "Look, Mark, I think it's best if I drop you off at the next gas station," she said, her voice trembling. But Mark's smile widened, his eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, we're not going to any gas station, Hannah. We're going somewhere special." Without warning, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, the blade catching the faint light. Hannah's blood ran cold. She knew she had to act fast. In a surge of adrenaline, she slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. Mark, caught off guard, lurched forward, the knife flying from his hand and clattering to the floor. Without wasting a second, Hannah unbuckled her seatbelt, flung open the driver's side door, and bolted into the night. Her heart pounded in her ears, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The darkness of the forest loomed ahead, her only hope of escape. Mark shouted behind her, his footsteps echoing on the pavement as he gave chase. Her lungs burned, but she pushed herself harder, desperate to escape. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows offering a slim hope of cover. Darting between the trees, Hannah zigzagged through the underbrush, branches scratching at her arms and face. She finally collapsed behind a large oak tree, gasping for breath. She listened intently, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. The forest was eerily silent, the only noise her own ragged breathing. Minutes passed and she heard nothing. Mark had either given up or lost her trail. Hannah stayed hidden until dawn, too terrified to move. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, she cautiously made her way back to the road. Her car was gone, but she was alive, She stumbled into the nearest town at dawn, exhausted and terrified. She reported the incident to the police, who conducted a thorough search. Mark was never found, and Hannah's car had vanished without a trace. The police officer's skeptical look didn't help ease her fear. For years, the memory of that night haunted her, a grim reminder of the malevolent dangers that can hide behind a friendly face and the shadowy roads she now avoids at all costs. It was a crisp autumn evening in 1987, and Jared was making his way back to his hometown in northern Michigan. The leaves had turned into a tapestry of reds, oranges, and yellows, blanketing the landscape in a vibrant array of fall colors. Jared enjoyed these solo drives, relishing the quiet time to reflect and listen to his favorite rock tunes. As he cruised down the desolate highway, he noticed the sun setting, casting long shadows across the road. Jared was about halfway home when he saw her, a young woman standing by the roadside, her thumb sticking out in a classic hitchhiker's pose. She looked to be in her early 20s, with long dark hair and a pale complexion that stood out starkly against the fading light. She wore a simple dress and carried a small backpack. Against his better judgment, Jared slowed the car and pulled over. "Need a lift?" he called out through the open passenger window. The woman nodded silently and climbed into the car. She settled into the seat, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jared noticed her trembling slightly, but decided not to pry. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves. Jared felt an uneasy tension building, the kind you get when you know something's not quite right but can't put your finger on it. "Where are you headed?" Jared finally asked, trying to break the silence. The woman turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Just a bit further down the road," she said in a soft, almost whisper-like voice. Jared nodded and continued driving. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was in some sort of trouble, but every attempt to engage her in conversation was met with short, terse answers. She seemed lost in her own world, occasionally glancing nervously out the window. After another 20 minutes of uneasy silence, Jared noticed a rest stop up ahead. He decided to pull in, hoping a brief break might help alleviate the tension. "How about a quick stop?" "Need anything from the store?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The woman nodded again, her face pale and drawn. They both got out, and Jared watched as she walked slowly towards the restroom, her head down. He grabbed a soda from the vending machine and leaned against the car, waiting. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Jared began to worry. He walked over to the restrooms and knocked on the door of the women's room. "Hey, everything okay in there?" he called out. No response. He knocked again, harder this time. "Hello, are you all right?" Still nothing. Jared's concern grew. He looked around, hoping to find someone to help, but the rest stop was deserted. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open slightly and called out again. The restroom was empty. The woman was gone. Panic set in. Jared ran back to his car, hoping she had returned while he was away. But the car was empty too. He searched the area frantically, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Feeling a chill creep up his spine, Jared got back into his car and resumed driving. The encounter left him deeply unsettled, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing on the road behind him. As night fell, Jared finally arrived home, his nerves frayed and his mind racing with unanswered questions. He decided to call the local police and report the strange encounter, hoping they might be able to shed some light on the mystery. The officer on the other end of the line listened patiently as Jared recounted the evening's events. When he finished, there was a long pause. "Sir, are you sure about what you saw?" the officer asked, his tone cautious. "Absolutely," Jared replied. "Why do you ask?" The officer sighed. "We've had similar reports over the years, always describing a young woman hitchhiking along that stretch of road. But every time someone tries to help, she disappears. Local legend has it that she was a girl who went missing decades ago, never to be found. Some say her spirit still roams those roads, looking for a way home." Jared felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea of having encountered a ghost seemed absurd, yet he couldn't deny what he had experienced. The woman had been real, or at least she had seemed real. From that night on, Jared never picked up another hitchhiker. The memory of the silent companion who vanished into the night haunted him, a chilling reminder that some roads are best traveled alone. 3 months after turning 16 in 2005, Chris finally got his first car, a '99 Toyota Camry. On a warm Saturday night, his friend Alex invited him to a big party. Knowing he wouldn't be in a condition to drive home afterward, Chris carpooled with Alex and his girlfriend, Brianna. They lived in rural Virginia, where big parties were rare and everyone attended when they happened. The drive was uneventful, the night filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The road to the party was a narrow 2-lane highway flanked by dense woods. As they arrived, the small house where the party was held was already bustling with activity, loud music, and laughter filling the air. Chris enjoyed the party, losing track of time amidst the revelry. A few hours and several drinks later, he realized it was past 2 a.m. His vision blurred and his steps wobbly. He looked for Alex, but his friend was nowhere to be found. Panic set in when Brianna, who was supposed to be their designated driver, told him she had to leave unexpectedly for a family emergency. Desperate and unsure what to do, Chris decided to walk home. He was only about 5 miles away, but in his inebriated state, it felt like an insurmountable distance. The chilly night air helped clear his head a bit as he staggered down the road. After walking for what seemed like an eternity, Chris saw headlights approaching from behind. He stuck out his thumb, hoping for a ride. The car slowed down and stopped beside him. The driver, a man in his late 30s with a kind face, rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" the man asked. "Yes, please," Chris slurred, grateful for the help. The man introduced himself as Tom and asked where Chris was headed. Chris gave him his address and sank into the passenger seat, exhaustion overwhelming him. He barely registered the questions Tom asked, his mind foggy and on the verge of passing out. When he woke up, the car was still moving, but the surroundings were unfamiliar. The road was no longer the narrow highway he knew. It was a dark, winding path through even denser woods. Panic surged through Chris. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. Tom glanced at him, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Just taking a little detour." Chris's stomach dropped. He had heard enough horror stories to know this wasn't right. "You can let me out here," he said, his voice shaking. "No, I don't think so," Tom replied, his tone cold and final. Fear gripped Chris. He fumbled for his phone, but it was dead. He glanced around, looking for anything he could use as a weapon, but the car was clean and empty. Desperation clawed at him, and he knew he had to think fast. Then an idea struck him. His stomach churned from the alcohol, and he forced himself to gag, retching loudly. Tom grimaced and tried to focus on the road, clearly uncomfortable. "Are you okay?" Tom asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Chris didn't respond, instead letting himself vomit all over Tom's lap. The reaction was immediate. Tom cursed loudly, the car swerving slightly as he tried to keep control. "You disgusting little..." Tom shouted, pulling over to the side of the road. "Get out now!" Chris didn't need to be told twice. As soon as the car stopped, he threw open the door and bolted into the woods. He could hear Tom cursing behind him, but he didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like jelly, finally collapsing behind a thick cluster of bushes. He lay there panting and listening intently for any sounds of pursuit. Minutes passed, then more, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. He stayed hidden until he was sure Tom had given up and driven away. With dawn breaking, Chris emerged from the woods and found his way back to the road. Exhausted and terrified, he walked until he reached the nearest town, where he called the police. He reported the incident, giving them as much detail about Tom and the car as he could remember. The police took his statement seriously, but they never found Tom or the car. Chris never saw Alex again and couldn't forgive him for abandoning him at the party. The memory of that night stayed with him, a haunting reminder of how quickly a seemingly harmless situation could turn dangerous. From that day forward, Chris vowed never to hitchhike again. If you want to see more horror stories, check out my next video.